myself. I have an academic background in philosophy and political science. I did my graduate research at Oxford University in the Faculty of Politics and did my doctorate there, but I had a background prior to that in philosophy. I work with the Cato Institute, which is a classical liberal and libertarian research institute in the United States, with the Atlas Network, which is a global network of about 420 different think tanks from Malaysia to Japan to Brazil, Canada, US, Russia, Bulgaria, etc., etc. And then also a number of other organizations, including Students for Liberty, which is a group that I've partnered with in producing a number of books. This is a recent one, which is a popular restatement of liberalism, mainly by young people, so mainly people just recently out of college. Now, the topic that I was asked to address has to do with terminological clarity, and in particular, the words liberalism, libertarianism, and neoliberalism. These terms are sometimes used and sometimes in confusing ways. And it's important to get straight on them so that we can have actual discussion where people can agree on some level on definitions and then begin to have a discussion about evaluation, whether the institutions that are intended by them are just or effective or efficient or good. There's a background to this. You may be acquainted with the philosopher named W.B. Galey, who discussed essentially contested concepts in the 1950s in a famous paper in 1956. And he looked at the way that certain terms such as democracy, even Christianity, and so on, are contested. Various people have conceptions of these, and they fight over what democracy means or whether an institution is truly democratic, and so on. And there are very elements, several elements that lead to a concept being contested that people would fight over. For example, it's unusual to find people saying that they're against democracy. There are some, of course, various extremists on left and right who reject democracy openly. But most people are fighting over what it means to be democratic, whether this regime is actually democratic or not. And even in some extreme cases, the dictatorship of North Korea even describes itself as the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, although it's hard to imagine that most people recognize any democracy in it. I'd like to address then three basic questions. And the first is the confusion around the words liberal and liberalism. These are sometimes used in different ways in different linguistic traditions and at different times. Second, about libertarian and libertarianism, how those are related to liberal and liberalism. And then finally, neoliberal and neoliberalism. Conclude with that. So let's start with the origins of the term liberalism. They're a bit obscure. It's difficult to trace the exact origin of a lot of terms, and this one seems to have several roots. We find the phrase, the liberal system, used in English by Adam Smith and The Wealth of Nations on 2 occasions in 1776. And he intended by that freedom of trade. So let me give you a quotation from Smith to give you a feeling for what he meant. Were all nations to follow the liberal system of free exportation and free importation, the different states into which a great continent, meaning Europe, was divided would so far resemble the different provinces of a great empire. As among the different provinces of a great empire, the freedom of the inland trade appears, both from reason and experience, not only the best palliative or corrective of a shortage, but the most effectual preventative of a famine. And so would the freedom of the exportation and importation trade be among the different states into which a great continent was divided. He was addressing here the appearance of famine in various European countries that could have been addressed by allowing corn or grain to be exported and imported. But there were often restrictions on the export or the importation of grain. So the system of free trade, this particular case of grain, in which people would buy and sell freely across borders, he called the liberal system. Jean-Baptiste Say, very important French economist, sometimes he's described as the French Adam Smith, but in many ways he advanced Adam Smith's thought quite dramatically. He made a number of important advances in economic theory. In 1803, in his treatise of political economy, he talked about les principes libéraux, the liberal principles, to describe the principles of freedom of trade, limited government, freedom of commerce, and so on. The term was first used, to my knowledge, the first time as a political term in 1812 in the struggles of the Spanish Cortes, the Spanish Parliament, to describe the supporters of constitutionalism in the context of a constitutional monarchy, were called los liberales, the freedom people. Interestingly, their opponents, who supported the unlimited power of the monarch, known as absolutism, were called los serviles, the servile ones, or the ones who were like slaves, because they wanted to serve their king. So los liberales, the liberals, and los serviles. Unfortunately, the term los serviles died out. It's not used anymore to describe the opponents of liberalism. But the term liberal and liberals came to have a political significance in the struggle for constitutional limitations on power. So we have it as an adjective, liberal principles and liberal system. It becomes a noun to refer to people, the liberals. What about the abstract noun liberalism? Where does this begin to emerge in European languages? And the first I've been able to find is in 1819 in a French pamphlet anonymously published, Examen du libéralisme par un libéral. I apologize for my bad French pronunciation. A look or examination of liberalism by a liberal. So this is, to my knowledge, the first occasion when liberalism is used as an abstract noun. And the author describes the principles of liberalism and puts them together as a system of liberalism. It quickly entered, after that period, into the English language, and then a wide multitude of other European languages, usually using the Latin root word liber, to be free, but in some cases also being translated into non-Indo-European or non-Latin roots. And it was used pretty consistently to refer to a philosophy for which liberty was the primary value, not the only one, but the one that gave meaning and significance to the others. Referred to limits on power, religious toleration, freedom of conscience, speech and press, equality of rights before the law regardless of religion, language, nationality, and so on, and popular political institutions that were charged with the function of serving the needs of the population, notably by establishing the rule of law and security of the rights of the person. Now, that may seem sort of obvious to people. Of course, that's what an institution should do. But in fact, it was a radical break from the dominant view, which was that the population should be harnessed or enlisted to serve the needs of the state, or of the king, or the dynasty, or the empire. And of course, that tradition continues on later, this anti-liberal approach under fascism and communism and other forms of collectivism. But liberalism argued, in contrast, the institutions of the state should be there to provide important social coordinating institutions for the population. The population did not exist to serve the rulers. Now, I mentioned the role that liberty plays as the dominant idea, and there's a very interesting book written by a Hungarian liberal that explored exactly the relationship between liberty and other ideas of the 19th century. He was a minister of education in the 1848 revolutionary government in Hungary. His name was József Eötvös. He was a very significant political thinker, and for those who follow Hungarian literature. He's one of the most important Hungarian writers of the 19th century. His novel really set a standard for modern literary Hungarian. And he also was largely responsible, or played a very important role, in the Compromise of 1867, which returned Hungary to constitutional rule. Because after the uprising, with the support of the Russian Tsar, the Austrian Emperor clamped down and destroyed constitutionalism in Hungary, which had a very long history. And it was only later, in 1867, that it was restored and you had the dual monarchy. In his book, it's called in English, The Influence of the Dominant Ideas of the 19th Century on the State, he identified three fundamental ideas that had emerged as dominant political ideas in the 19th century: liberty, equality, and nationality. And if you know 19th century political thought and history, you see these are very important ideas that come to prominence. He says there's a problem. They're not obviously mutually compatible. If you make nationality the dominant idea, the ruling idea, then you don't have inequality among nations, and the liberty of the person will be subordinated to the nation. If it's equality, understood certainly in material terms, he said this is not compatible with liberty. This was the idea of communism at the time. But he said they can be made compatible if one idea is dominant, and that is liberty. That there should be equality of liberty for all persons. He exemplified this in his life. He was the main figure who promoted and achieved the liberation of the Jews, for instance, in Hungary. They achieved legal equality largely because of the work of Rothfuss. So he thought it was equality of liberty that mattered. And then also a more radical idea that was not implemented, which was liberty of nationality. He wrote a very important book in 1858 called Die Nationalitätsfrage, the nationalities question. It's a most interesting book because he predicted, if we do not solve this problem, this area will become a slaughterhouse. There will be so much murder. And he understood, I think, very well the problems of these emerging kind of nationalisms, Slavic, Hungarian, Germanic, and so on, that we're going to clash. And he proposed a liberal approach to this, which was to let nationality be a matter of personal choice. You could choose Hungarian nationality, Czech nationality, Ukrainian nationality, German, whatever it might be. No one would rule the others. And you would then be subject to the legal system and educational system of your choice. So he worked out an extensive approach for this kind of radical confederalism, if you will. Interestingly enough, his ideas were not implemented, but they had an impact on what we call the Austro-Marxists. In the early years of the 20th century, Karl Renner, Otto Bauer in Austria recognized the persistent problems of the Habsburg Empire of Central Europe, which was multiple nationalities. In 1900, a liberal journalist, a self-identified liberal journalist, Irish-American, named E.L. Godkin, wrote a most interesting essay in the pages of a magazine called The Nation, which at the time was a leading liberal magazine in the United States. Went through other forms and incarnations, was even a Stalinist magazine in the 1940s and 50s, and now is a left-of-center kind of magazine. But at this time, in the year 1900, it was a classical liberal magazine. He wrote, and I quote, "To the principles and precepts of liberalism, the prodigious, huge, material progress of the age was largely due. Freed from the meddling of governments, men devoted themselves to their natural task, the bettering of their condition, and the wonderful results which surround us." Everyone knew in 1900, people were freer, they were wealthier, they were healthier than at any other time in human history prior to that. But then he continued in a very pessimistic way. Something was changing. He recognized it. Quote, "It now seems that its material comfort has blinded the
possible. And that politics in the world of liberalism is a declining, almost a defunct force. There's actually talk of organizing the Liberal Imperialist Party, a combination of repugnant tendencies and theories as impossible as that of fire and water. There's also a faction of so-called liberals who so little understand their tradition as to make common cause with the socialists. Only a remnant, old men for the most part, still uphold the liberal doctrine, and when they are gone, it will have no champions. If you read the essay, it's really quite chilling. He says that an old foe, the divine right of kings, has re-emerged in new forms. He said, before it is again repudiated, there must be international struggles on a terrific scale. I think he understood very well what the 20th century was going to bring. Because liberalism was declining intellectually, the new forms of nationalism, racial theories, fascism, socialism, Bolshevism were rising, and he said there would be international struggles on a terrific scale. You could imagine how depressed he was as he wrote that. It was about this time that we see kind of intellectual unraveling of liberalism. What Godwin called the liberal doctrine was being undermined by a new doctrine called new liberalism, sometimes social liberalism in the United States and Europe. In the United States, that term came to be called just liberalism. It's an interesting question how and why that happened. The English radical liberal Herbert Spencer identified as one element of confusion between ends and means. Interesting hypothesis. As he put it, quote, the gaining of a popular good being the external trait common to liberal measures in earlier days, in each case gained by a relaxation of restraints, it has happened that popular good has come to be sought by liberals, not as an end to be gained indirectly by relaxation of restraints, but as the end to be gained directly. And seeking to gain it directly, they have used methods intrinsically opposed to those originally used. In other words, when people thought of liberalism, they thought of material progress and scientific progress. That was the outcome. And they said, well, that's what we want. We want the material progress. We want the greater equality. We want the scientific advance. Just get it directly through direct state measures. And Spencer thought this was a mistake. Liberalism referred to the means. The ends, the outcome was the positive goal. But liberalism was about means. You could not pass a law that said scientific progress law. Just achieve it directly. At a more metaphysical level, philosophers who were influenced by G.W.F. Hegel had a tremendous impact. About this time, many British and American academics went to study in Germany. And they were deeply influenced by the new German academic system, the universities, and they loved the PhD, which was a German invention, essentially. And a number of Americans and Brits went and got their PhDs in Germany. And they brought back political ideals largely influenced by Hegel. A very important one was named Thomas Hill Green. And he said what we should strive for is a higher freedom, the authentic freedom of the human person. And I quote, so we shall probably all agree that freedom, rightly understood, is the greatest of blessings. It's attainment of the true end of all our fellow citizens. But when we thus speak of freedom, we should consider carefully what we mean by it. We, Green, do not mean merely freedom from restraint or compulsion. We do not mean merely freedom to do as we like, irrespectively of what it is that we like. We do not mean a freedom that can be enjoyed by one man or one set of men at the cost of the loss of freedom of others. When we, this is Green, speak of freedom as something to be highly prized, we mean a positive power or capacity of doing or enjoying something worth doing or enjoying. something that we do or enjoy in common with others. So the key here was doing what you ought to do. That was freedom. Doing what the higher self wanted. Not just what you want to do, the empirical self, but what you would call the noumenal self, or the true self wanted. And so Green insisted the mere, quote, the mere removal of compulsion, the mere enabling, notice the word mere, as though it's insignificant. To remove the chains from slaves was insignificant. When the slaves were liberated, it was merely removing their chains. He says the mere enabling a man to do as he likes is in itself no contribution to true freedom. So there's a very radical difference in the understanding of freedom here. In other words, when the slaves were liberated in various countries that eliminated slavery, or the serfs were liberated, that made no contribution to their freedom. What only mattered was when they came to want and desire what they should want and should desire. And consequently, true freedom required compulsion. This is why Green in his life was dedicated to the prohibition of alcohol, for example. He thought alcohol made you a slave to alcohol, and if we make alcohol illegal, we will free you. And so his campaign was a whole series of state measures to free you from desire for alcohol, tobacco, all these different things, sex, and so on. Then you would be truly, truly free. It entailed subjugation of the individual to higher purposes. And we can see a variety of quite anti-liberal doctrines understood in the previous sense, but this is now called the new liberalism. New liberalism. And it requires a very active, powerful state to make us be the people we ought to be, and then also to provide goods and services that will enable us to see our true ends, to realize our true self. Those contributed in the English-speaking world to a change in the meaning of liberalism, but actually most especially in the United States, less so in other countries. Even other Anglo-Saxon countries, such as Australia, retain more or less the older meaning of liberal. In the United Kingdom, a little bit less, but the term economic liberalism in the United Kingdom has always meant free market policy. So it was mainly in the United States that came to change. Economist Joseph Schumpeter, in his History of Economic Analysis, put it rather nicely. He said, quote, as a supreme, if unintended compliment, the enemies of the system of private enterprise have thought it wise to appropriate its label. So he said that what happened was, what was called liberalism in the United States was really the opposite of what it had been prior to that, at least in economic policy. Herbert Spencer also referred to this new liberalism as the new Toryism. Tory, of course, meaning conservative in British political language. And he said, most of those who now pass as liberals are Tories of a new type. He said this was the old Toryism under a new label. As I mentioned, this was largely confined to the Anglo-Saxon world. However, as English has come to become more significant as an international language, so French, German, and other languages decline in terms of their valence internationally. English has moved ahead for a variety of reasons. The significance of the United States, the British Empire prior to that, and the relative ease of English grammar compared to Latvian or other languages. English has come to become a dominant second language around the planet. And therefore, those who engage in academic discourse are likely to look back to a discourse in the English language. And consequently, this meaning of liberalism has come to become more widespread internationally. But we can distinguish the old liberalism, if you will, and this new liberalism understood in American terms. What about the term libertarian or libertarianism?
It's an interesting word. It originally emerged in philosophical discussions about free will and determinism. Determinism is the view that you have no choice, that everything you do was determined by the initial or prior conditions, that human beings are no different from billiard balls being knocked about. And then the opposite side of this, that said that human beings have choice in a way that billiard balls or stones do not, was called libertarianism, so in that philosophical context. But it started to acquire a political meaning and a political significance in the early years of the 20th century, mainly in the United States, as liberalism began to acquire a different meaning in the United States. People would use the term libertarian to distinguish themselves from this new social or new liberalism. Now, to make it a little bit more complicated, it was sometimes used by various socialists to refer to a society without private property, but also without a state. So the various anarcho-communists, followers of Mikhail Bakunin, and so on, were sometimes called libertarian socialists. Usually these were German writers. And so that indicates a little bit of additional confusion because they had in mind something rather different. They were against the state, they wanted to eliminate it. They thought the state was a terrible thing because it enforced property rights. Whereas the other liberals, or libertarians, thought property rights are very important. And if you are to have a state, it should certainly protect them. But we'll set that aside. That second meaning has declined quite dramatically. It's not so common anymore. So-called libertarian socialism. The term libertarian became much more prominent in the United States because of a number of figures, notably a writer named Leonard Read, who wrote a whole series of popular books in which he used the term libertarian to mean what had been called liberal generations before. As to how it's used today, it's normally used in two different ways. On the one hand, as a radical form of classical liberalism. The old liberalism now is sometimes called classical liberalism to distinguish it from American liberalism. So sometimes libertarian is used to mean a very radical, perhaps anarchistic or anti-state version of classical liberalism. And sometimes it's used to just mean liberalism, as it used to be called, to avoid this philosophical confusion. A recent book from Cambridge University Press on these issues by George Smith, which I really highly recommend. It's a very good, clear book, called The System of Liberty, described the reemergence of classical liberalism, and he says libertarianism is its more radical manifestation. It's my experience in most countries that libertarian is coming to be the word used to mean what 100 years ago was just called liberalism. And in some countries has been called liberalism until very recently. But now, here's the most interesting part. Most of this is a bit of history of thought. The term neoliberalism. It also has a bit of a convoluted history. But what's interesting is most of the people who use the term today would be very surprised at the history of the term. They don't seem to know anything about the way the term has been used. The first time you hear neoliberalism, as opposed to new liberalism in English, which was Thomas Hill Green and these enemies of classical liberalism, the neoliberalism was used from the 1930s through roughly the mid-1960s, primarily in German. And it was intended to mean a kind of third way. And interestingly enough, the term third way was explicitly used between capitalism and socialism. This neoliberalism represented a third way. The man who coined the term was a German economist, political writer, sociologist named Alexander Rustov. He's a very interesting figure. He played a significant role in the revival of liberalism in Germany after the Second World War. In 1932, he gave a speech to the Verein für Sozialpolitik, the Association for Social Policy, whose chairman at the time was a well-known Marxist, Werner Sombach, and he was asked to give a presentation. And the title of his presentation was Freie Wirtschaft, starker Staat. Free economy, strong state. And what he meant by that was not an authoritarian state, but a state that would be able to enforce the rule of law and would have an active role in the economy. So it was not, this term starker Staat can be mistranslated into other languages. He was not an authoritarian, he was a leading opponent of Hitler and escaped from Germany after he was arrested, and some of his friends were tortured and killed, and he was able to escape in 1933 for Turkey, where he took up an academic post, and continued his studies, and one of his main interests in his later studies was what made possible the emergence of a totalitarian state, because this was such a shock to intellectuals in Germany to see what had happened in the country. And he wrote a typical German book, which was 3 enormous volumes, called Ortsbestimmung der Gegenwart, the origins of the present, if you will. In 1938, before the war, he had gone to France with a number of other European liberals, and they took part in a colloquium. And it was designed to revive liberalism, because they saw all around them liberalism was intellectually and politically in ruins. And rival ideologies, Bolshevism and communism, fascism, National Socialism were dominant. This was obviously a very terrible time. And the book that had come out of that year by Walter Lippmann in the United States was called The Good Society. It got a lot of attention, and he was critical of all of these forms of collectivism and tried to revive the principles of liberalism. So in 1938, they had a colloquium that drew together intellectuals from around much of Europe, and they founded a new organization, the Centre International d'Études pour la Rénovation du Libéralisme, so the International Center for the Renovation of Liberalism. But obviously the war happened just after, and so this was smashed. Paris ended up being occupied after this period, and the organization never was able to get off the ground, although they had established the foundation for it. The project was later taken up in 1947. Friedrich Hayek from Austria, who had been living during all this time in England, called the same participants and many others together for the formation of an international society for the promotion of liberalism. They ended up calling it the Mont Pelerin Society, named after the town where the organization met in Switzerland. Now, what did neoliberalism mean at this time? It did not mean laissez-faire. It did not mean what was associated with the classical liberalism. It meant a state that would create the institutional foundations of a free society. A strong state in that sense could actually bring about rule of law, could have judges and police force and court system, administrative law, that could protect the rights and freedom of the individual person. But more than that, because classical liberalism wanted that, this state would also intervene to protect against economic concentration. They're great fans of competition laws, it's called in Europe, or antitrust law in the United States, would provide social services and so on. And it was intended to be a middle way. So laissez-faire, communism, they were going to go down the middle path. So Alexander Rustov, Alfred Müller-Amag, Wilhelm Röpke, who escaped from Germany, from Switzerland, and Ludwig Erhard, who later becomes finance minister in the new Federal Republic of Germany, embraced this philosophy, and they called it Sozialmarktwirtschaft, social market economy. It was to become the new form of economic organization in Germany and elsewhere as well. So here's something interesting. Most people who use neoliberalism do not mean that. They do not mean this. They mean something else. The German liberals diagnosed, I think misdiagnosed, that the economic concentration of German industry in the very late 19th century to the 20th century was because of two little state intervention rather than too much. This is a controversial discussion in German economic history, but I think it's quite convincing. Starting in 1873, the German Reich begins formal cartelization of the industry in Germany. They create state-organized cartels, 1879, massive protectionism, and so on. This is not a laissez-faire economy in Germany in the late 19th and early 20th century. But Lipke and others thought the solution was not merely eliminating these cartel laws, but creating laws against cartels. Interesting controversy. In any case, the term neoliberalism was then dropped in the 1960s. It falls out of common use, and the term social market economy continues. If you go to Germany today, among German conservatives, for example, if you say market economy, they will correct you. They say you mean social market economy. It's a very important principle or term of German political dialogue. It's also known in Germany as Ordo-liberalism. There was an academic journal, still is, called Ordo, published in Freiburg, and it was a dominant intellectual journal of this tradition of Ordo-liberalism, which is a synonym for neoliberalism understood in this German context. It also surfaced again in the United States, the term neoliberalism, in the 1980s. A magazine called the Washington Monthly and another one called the New Republic used it to refer to centrist American Democrats, politicians in the Democratic Party. And prominent among them were Bill Clinton and Al Gore, so they later ran for president and vice president, respectively, were called for a time neoliberals. That, however, died out, it did not take off. And I think the reason is the term liberalism had by itself become rather tainted in the electoral political sphere. Not intellectually in the academy, but in modern American politics. And most politicians will not call themselves liberal in the United States today because it has come to have a bad smell for many voters. So neoliberalism was dropped. But how is the term neoliberalism used today? Go into academic discourse, do a Google search on the term. Thousands and thousands of articles will pop up, websites, and so on. It's not clear what is intended. Indeed, you rarely find a definition, and when you do, it's usually incoherent. Taylor Boas and Jordan Gans Morse, two professors of political science at the University of California, Berkeley, did a content analysis of hundreds of academic journal articles that use the term neoliberalism. They tried to tease out of it to pull out what do they mean by it, how is it used, what is the definition. And as they noted, quote, those who employ the term in empirical research often do not define it. It's just dropped out there with no definition, unlike most other terms in political science. Here are a couple of possible definitions you can try to extract from the way it's used. Number one is a preference for markets over conscious state direction. That's compatible with both classical liberalism and the neoliberalism of Gustav and Rula Amag and the others. Number two, a belief that the state should never act at all. Somehow just a radical anti-statism. That is not compatible with other previous uses of the term liberalism, whether classical liberalism or American new liberalism or German neoliberalism, which saw a very important role for the state in the provision of public order. Number three, a desire to eliminate state transfers to the poor while retaining them for the rich. That's incompatible with all other definitions of liberalism that have been offered, but you find it quite frequently in the discussions of neoliberalism. And four, the use of state-backed international organizations to, and this is a very common phrase, if you Google it, you'll find a lot of it, impose neoliberalism, which is understood as the absence of state activity. But there's something incoherent about state organizations imposing the absence of state activity. I find that a bizarre formulation. The World Bank, International Monetary Fund, World Trade Organization, and so on are identified as institutions of neoliberalism. All of them are state organizations. Or sometimes they refer to the Washington Consensus, which is a term invented by one particular person to refer to common elements of IMF, International Monetary Fund policy. But interestingly enough, number 2 on the list was that the state should be investing heavily in social transfers, social services, and infrastructure. So that definition is incompatible with the one that's usually in mind by people who use it. But what's clear is every time the term is ever used, it is always negative in its significance. Consistently and significantly, it is a negative term. Indeed, I have never in my life met a self-identified neoliberal. I'm not quite old enough to have known Alexander Rustov and those German liberals. They died off many years ago. I've never met anyone who is identified with the term. I attend the meetings of the Mont Pelerin Society and other liberal organizations, and no one has ever identified himself or herself as a neoliberal. Indeed, although you sometimes read of it as a political philosophy or a political movement, I would wonder what kind of a philosophy is it that has no self-identified adherents? What kind of a political movement is it that has no self-identified members? It's a kind of a puzzle. And you'll often find the phrase, this political movement, but you'll never find anyone who says they're a member. And this political philosophy, but you find no one who identifies as an adherent or exponent of it. And that suggests it's just an insult. It's not actually referring to anything that's a part of a political discourse. Boas and Gans Morris conclude their study. They said, quote, one compelling indicator of the term's negative connotation is that virtually no one self-identifies as a neoliberal, even though scholars frequently associate others, politicians, academic advisors, and even fellow academics with this term. So it seems to me neoliberal is a term that's used to avoid confronting the advocates of liberalism directly. Anti-market ideologues on both the left and the right find neoliberalism is used by Jobbik and right-wing movements that are anti-market and by left-wing movements as well. They've essentially invented a new philosophy that they can use to beat up on. But you can't find anyone who will actually identify with it. The only thing we know about it is that it's heartless, destructive, and evil. That they seem to be the primary characteristics of the philosophy. But a term that's so full of negative evaluative connotations, it seems to me, cannot serve as a descriptive term in scientific or even just civil discourse. It's been degraded just to the level of insult. And so what I have tried to do in my writings is to challenge people who use this to say, just what do you mean by it? And one finds typically they won't give you an answer. Or it ends up being a mixture of policies you could identify as liberal in the old sense of the term, plus a whole range of statist policies that might have very, very different significance, such as higher taxes, not something you normally associate with liberalism, state interventionism, and even some people have identified the Iraq War as neoliberal, which is particularly puzzling, because all liberals are opposed to the Iraq War as an example of state power. Well, with that, just some thoughts on the origins of these terms and how they're related. I'd be interested in hearing if you hear those terms frequently, particularly the last one, neoliberalism, what it brings to mind for you, and do you think that these are meaningful terms for use in political discourse? So I'm going to stop talking. I'm interested in your thoughts. Yes.
Yes, I was wondering actually, while I was listening to you, I now understood that in the 19th century Russian literature there is also a meaning of liberal as someone who is sort of a weakling who only speaks about values and sort of a big person but doesn't do anything revolutionary or for support for someone. So I thought this is also has a negative meaning, but it's maybe sort of a contrast to somebody could change things in a revolutionary way.
It means someone who's passive. Right?
Yeah, a passive, weak, and just an observing things.
Well, were there also people who self-identified with the liberal term in the Russian literature at the time, though?
Well, I think I could respond to you because I study liberalism in Russia, and here I would ask what kind of period do you speak about liberalism in Russian 19th century context? Because if speaking about liberalism as political ideology, it starts only in the beginning of the 20th century, and in this context, it appeared to be more revolutionary than conservative. But I would like to ask you a question this way, because, another way, because when studying liberalism, I faced a methodological or theoretical problem. Because liberalism as a term, as a concept, was used in various ways and was used by various actors who invested certain meanings in it. But at the same time, there is a kind of Marxist approach, studying liberalism as an ideology, as a set of beliefs, as a coherent set of beliefs. And here it's quite puzzling for me to define actually the agents or liberalism as a certain group, because one can claim, yes, we are liberals, but comparing to other liberal movements, they are not quite liberal because they profess the values which are in conflict with liberal doctrine.
What would be a concrete example?
Okay, in Russian case, there were two kind of liberalisms. One liberalism that was expressed by Russian Constitutional Democratic Party, and it was more kind of individualistic. It was concerned with the individual rights of the citizens. It was at the same time very close to socialist ideology in a way that it had a certain idea of welfare state, which was quite close to Gladstonian type of liberalism. And there was another type of liberalism that was more conservative, for example, expressed by the Party of the Union of the 17th of October. But their major accent was preserving state order. At the same time, they were very nationalistic, and they were very more oriented to autocracy, but a little bit restricted by fundamental law. But at the same time, they had more nationalistic, more conservative program.
Mm-hmm.
So, if comparing, for example, the cadets, they were closer to socialist oriented liberalism, the way it was in Britain at that time. But the liberalism of Octobrists, sometimes I can't call them liberals.
One question as a point of clarification. Sometimes people, including some liberals, identify the welfare state as a form of socialism. And I don't think that is helpful in terminology. If socialism was understood in the way that Marx, some of his followers, and certainly Lenin thought the abolition of the market, the elimination of the price system, the welfare state isn't that. It was an attempt to create a state that would provide certain social institutions and welfare and so on. but not the elimination of the market.
They did not strive for elimination of the market.
But that's what the socialists were promoting, was the market had to be replaced by some kind of conscious system of playing. So that even the new liberals that Herbert Spencer was concerned about, that had welfare state type policies, none of them actually advocated elimination of the market. So that socialism in that sense was not on the table, right?
But at the same time, I would say that it was a response to socialist movements at that time by including the program of state care of the workers, and it was a kind of tramp taken from the socialist movements as well.
You had a thought, sir?
Oh, well, I had a question of my own, so just carry on if you have.
We'll come back to this because that's an interesting question, and I'm not well acquainted with the Russian tradition.
But the problem for me is not the context, the Russian context, but the theoretical problem of defining liberalism, whether as a concept or as a set of beliefs, how these two theoretical approaches, which in a certain way contradict each other, how can they be...
You're talking about these two in the Russian context, or you mean concept or set of beliefs?
Yeah.
Well, you can have a set of beliefs that are organized in a conceptual fashion, though. I don't see any obvious problem with that. And that was what Utvesh and others wanted, was to have the concept of liberty was an organizing fundamental principle for liberal thought. But that meant other concepts such as order, justice, and so on somehow were interconnected with it. So it's a cluster of concepts. The socialist conception of order is very different from a liberal conception of order. For example, they both invoke the term order. But the socialist concept of order was one that would be consciously planned. The human realization of our freedom by being able to plan our own future. For the liberal, they said, well, that's regimentation, that's not order. That there's a lot of order that isn't consciously planned, not the carrying out of any conscious idea. So both of them use the concept of order, but they have different conceptions. Use another approach to the issue. So liberal conception of order includes spontaneous order. Things such as language, market economy, evolve and grow spontaneously. They don't have to be planned. The socialist conception of order typically involved the realization, to use a positive term, or imposition, to use a somewhat negative term, of a plan. And that was the sole source of order. And so you could still say that the order is a concept in the liberal ideology, but it has a unique liberal formulation, which is ordered to the concept of liberty, or free order, to use a term that's actually commonly used at the time, but they favored a free order rather than an imposed or a regimented one. Is that helpful at all? Or have I misunderstood the nature of the problem?
I think, right now I just understand that there were really many types of liberalism because
Yes, sure.
Perhaps the classical understanding of the order as spontaneous in the liberal discourse, but at the same time in the late 19th century. For example, in the German thought, it was quite a different thing because state was a kind of a guarant of an order. It was not an order from below which somehow spontaneously appear and is regulated by invisible hand, as in Adam Smith's variant. But in the German political thought, it was quite a different understanding of an order, that a state somehow creates an order and makes the society.
Well, I would just make one last comment on that.
It's
There were lots of Germans who had the other view, though. There were, I think, about Wilhelm von Humboldt, for example, who did not understand the state, and then what you identify as the German way. He was certainly a German thinker. And politically, the leaders of the liberal forces in the German parliaments did not believe that. So what they promoted was the customs union, the formation of a free trade zone within Germany, which created a huge increase in economic activity. But they did not want the establishment of an empire. This was very important to them. Bismarck's conception, which finally wins, he defeated Eugen Richter and the German liberals. They were bitter enemies, he hated them. As he said of Eugen Richter, he has the soul of an English shopkeeper. It's a terrible insult for a Prussian militarist. He wanted, as he said, unification of Germany not through petitions and referenda, which is what the liberals wanted, but through iron and blood.
Yeah.
It's a very different conception. So that other conception of liberalism was very much present in Germany, but it was defeated. That's really, in my opinion, one of the saddest features of the history of the last 150 years, was the defeat of German liberalism by Bismarck and what followed after that, which is the growth of the empire through conflict with Austria, conflict with France, the idea of a unified German state, that the state would be one state for one nation, and this was a disaster for Europe, partly because Germans were settled all over. This was really a horrible doctrine. But there was a liberalism that opposed that, and it unfortunately was defeated politically and decisively. And only later, after the First World War, does it begin to reformulate it, is defeated again. And then, after the Second World War, it comes back, and liberalism becomes, I think you could say, the dominant intellectual force in post-war Germany, having suffered these other defeats. But we'll talk about that some more. Yes, sir.
Yeah, well, so in fact my question is connected with what you just talked about. So my point is, so what do you make of the fact that the term liberalism is a positive, or this is a mutual description of a specific set of kind of framework conditions, like framework importation, exportation, and like barriers and rule of law, etc., are kind of retain its currency for a fairly long period of time only in England and in the United States to some extent. Whereas in continental Europe, especially in the German circle, I'm talking about what was to become the German Empire, Austria-Hungary, Sweden, the Russian Empire, it lost its currency fairly quickly and turned into a kind of rather disparaging term, if not a term of insult. Because I think I saw a paper on the subject a couple of years ago, and it investigated this very fast shift, investigating the German publicists who wrote about liberalism and who wrote about the desired economic policies. And so there was a huge shift from the enthusiasm about liberalism dating back to, I think, 1848 and these developments and on through the unification and through the wars, and then it was perceived more or less as the description of an, so to say, endemically English system of governance, with all of its dark spots and consequences, like, say, the state of Ireland and the plight of the working classes. And I can't recall or I can't come up with the name of the person who actually coined the term, who argued, and the new term gained some currency, that liberalism was just obfuscating the true nature of something we should term Manchesterism, just this kind of. And
Manchesterism emerges as a German term.
It is a German term indeed, but it is a German term, and it's not just about Count von Bismarck and a bunch of Prussian aristocrats. So it was the kind of dissatisfaction and disenchantment with the promise of liberalism that appears to have happened over a course of a couple of decades.
Well, I think it's partly because of the rise of an ideology of nationalism. And I think this accounts for a lot of it.
Well, it had been around since the very beginning of the 19th century.
Liberalism or nationalism?
Nationalism.
Well, it becomes a dominant force, though, and begins to occlude and push out, certainly, liberalism. And then you get scary combinations, National Socialism, for example, which becomes utterly toxic. But I think nationalism comes to force out liberalism. This is what Ötvös is concerned about. And in particular sees it as a foreign doctrine. It's inherently not us.
That's the point.
Now, it doesn't do that so much in France, by the way, partly because France had a very strong intellectual liberal tradition, going back to the physiocrats, Turgot, Jean-Baptiste Say, and so on. So that liberalism is not identified in France as a foreign ideology. It's eclipsed by the end of the 19th century. There are not that many French liberals left. Although Frédéric Passy, first winner of the Nobel Prize, was a well-known French liberal, there were still some. All the way up until the 60s, Jacques Rouet, and so on, this old liberals. But I don't think you find in France it's identified as foreign in the same way, which is puzzling because France and England had such hundreds of years of rivalry. But the same term is used on both sides of the channel. But you're quite right, in Germany, especially, it comes to be articulated as something that is foreign and, by the way, Jewish. This is also one of the sad elements of the story, is liberalism is identified as a Jewish ideology, and therefore not Christian, and therefore not us, for the majority of the population. And unsurprisingly, a great many of the exponents of liberalism in Germany were Jewish. So the more intellectually oriented, highly educated population, German Judaism was one of the most educated populations in Europe. They were highly concentrated in the professions. There's various reasons why we associate them with liberalism. And as liberalism is increasingly identified as Jewish, English, foreign, it falls under favor.
And being imposed from outside.
Sorry?
And being imposed from outside in one way or
Well,
expansion.
let's take an example. There's a very interesting book, which I'm just reviewing again, Carl Schmitt. I think he's one of the most evil men I've ever read in my life. I'm just astonished by Carl Schmitt. An unsurprisingly unrepentant Nazi all his life, until his last dying breath, he was a Nazi. And in it, he has an articulation of political life based on the enemy. This is explicitly anti-liberal doctrine. Right? Liberalism sees people as potential friends to betray in the context of the rule of law. He saw human political entities as coalescing around life and death struggles. Well, this is the philosophy of fascism in a nutshell, in my opinion. And it has become a kind of Bible of much anti-liberal academic discourse to this day. But he talks about Franz Oppenheimer, the most interesting German liberal of the sort. Here he says that he saw a polarity of state and society. He declares his aim to be the destruction of the state. It's not exactly right about Oppenheimer, but you could read Oppenheimer in an anarchistic way. His liberalism is so radical that he no longer permits the state to be even an armed office guard. The destruction is effected by advancing a value and passion-ridden definition. Oppenheimer wrote a very interesting book on the state. And he argued, Schmitt did, that exchange was a more vicious form of domination than killing a man. Essentially, that's what he argues. In his response to Joseph Schumpeter, who wrote an essay, The Sociology of Imperialism, Schumpeter distinguished imperialism is based on conquest versus free trade. Schumpeter, old-fashioned liberal free trade. Quote, essentially unwarlike is the terminology based on the essence of liberal ideology.
But an imperialism based on pure economic power, interesting, will naturally attempt to sustain a worldwide condition which enables it to apply and manage unmolested its economic means, for example, terminating credit and borrowing raw materials, destroying the currency of others, and so on. And this dates back to the notion of the German Empire as a rival to the British Empire. That's why they had to create a colonial empire, Africa, and so on, to combat the British. He says here that the adversary is thus no longer called an enemy, but merely a disturber of peace, and is thereby designated to be an outlaw of humanity. His argument, if I've understood him though, is that to really experience political life is to experience the willingness to kill another person, to engage in contest with the other. And that means, in its realization, that the existence of the German nation had to be in contest with the existence of the others, Poles, French, and so on and so forth. The liberal conception was the opposite of that, and said you could have Poles and French and all these other nationalities if you have trade. Then they could be friends rather than enemies. His view was that inherently one would come to dominate the other through economic exchange. And I just find it a savage and barbaric philosophy. It's hard to describe what it is to read that. His friend Ernst Jünger, if you know who he was, a very important figure. Like Carl Schmitt, he lived to be over 100. These old Nazis just lived forever, it seemed. And in his book, in Stahlgewitter, the Storm of Steel, which is his description of his fighting in World War I as a stormtrooper, understood in that military sense. He said at the end, he gives a statement which is an artistic realization of this. He mocked people who favored peace. He made fun of them, so they were small, mean, terrible people, all namely the liberals who had opposed the insanity of the war. And he said, we may have stood in the mud and blood up to our knees, but we had our eyes focused on something higher. And they call those the ideals of 1914. And I think we should look back on that with hindsight and say the ideals of 1914 were a catastrophe for the human race, just a total catastrophe. And that the liberal ideas, which were mocked as low and insignificant trading and buying and selling things, as opposed to fighting and struggling and killing, we should bring about the liberal reappraisal of those values. Fighting and killing are barbaric and savage, and buying and selling things is a higher form of human activity than that. So I think these rival ideologies, rather than the forces of history, were at work. And the ideology of nationalism was extremely powerful. If you've seen the images when World War I broke out in European capitals, gigantic crowds of people, and they're celebrating. They're just all celebrating. And what happened afterwards, it should sober us to think they were celebrating, and what happened was an unbelievable catastrophe. I mean, the death in Russia was just staggering what was experienced in this part of the world. And then, of course, you get World War II. So, long and the short, when I'm in Germany and talk about these things, I say very unflattering things about Bismarck. And German students have almost never heard this, because the normal presentation of the history of Germany in the standard schools is the unification of Germany in the Second Reich was a great moment. I think it was a disaster. It was just a horrible moment in human history. Not because I'm anti-German, it's quite the contrary, but because everything that happened after it was a disaster. So I tell them, I say, so the unification was a great moment, right? Absolutely. I say, okay. And out of that, what do you get? You get the conflict with England and the colonial empire. You get World War I. You get the interwar disaster, the rise of Hitler. You get World War II, the destruction of Germany, its division into two parts. This is a success? surely the liberal approach had something to be said for it in contrast to what we got. So, long answer to the question, why does liberalism fall out of favor? I think it's because nationalism becomes dominant. So, yes?
You mentioned that now nobody wants to call themselves this term, but I was remembering that the third party in Great Britain, I forgot what's the full name, I mean, the Labour, the Conservatives, and the third
called Liberal Democrats.
Yeah, so they sort of, would you maybe tell us what do they mean maybe by having this term?
Well, first of all, I did not say no one wants to call themselves liberal. There are a lot of people who call themselves liberals. I've just never met anyone who calls himself or herself a neoliberal. That's the one that seems to be just an insult. If you can't find anyone who identifies with it, they should tell you this is not an actual term of political discourse. But in terms of the way that liberal democrat is used in the Liberal Democratic Party, it's a rather interesting phenomenon. What happened was the Labour Party had gone through a major crisis. They were a true socialist party in the sense that they wanted to abolish the market and have total state ownership of the means of production. In the founding document of the Labour Party, it's called Clause 4. Clause 4 committed them to nationalization of all state industries, of all industries in the country. And this became quite unpopular because these state industries were just a disaster. They were bleeding money and sustained by all of the private industries that were extraordinarily burdened. And there was a great crisis. Mrs. Thatcher arrived into office in 1979 because of a perceived collapse of the program of the Labour Party, and that there had to be structural reforms, privatization of these gigantic British Steel, British Shipping, British Airways, British Telecom, just a long list, British Coal, British Gas, and so on, that were state industries, and they were huge, overstaffed, inefficient institutions that were sucking wealth out of society. The Labour Party was so committed to those principles they would not abandon them. And you had two wings in the British political party organization. There's the parliamentary party, which is made up of the members of parliament affiliated, and then there's the party membership. You might think the party membership means the people who are members, except under the British Labour Party, the labour unions were members, okay? And that meant leaders of communist unions could come in and cast 600,000 votes on behalf of all of their members. And there were various British unions dominated by communists. And so they would refuse to allow the Labour Party to change their principles. A group of members split and formed what came to be called the Social Democratic Party. So they were Labour Party sitting members of Parliament who left the Labour Party, kept their seats, and said, we form a new party called Social Democratic Party. It was much more free market oriented and more friendly to market principles of the privatization process. They began to lose some of their seats because the Labour Party then challenged them, and we had three-way races, a Conservative, a Labour, and a Social Democrat. There was one Liberal member of Parliament who was still, his name was David Steele, as I recall, who was the last remaining member of the old British Liberal Party, which was a liberal party, free trade, anti-war, anti-imperialism, pro-toleration, and so on. The Social Democratic Party and the tiny Liberal Party merged, and they formed the Liberal Democratic Party. They had substantial representation in Britain. They were more free market than the Labour Party by far. Although the Labour Party under Tony Blair got rid of Clause 4, and they modernized and became much more liberal in the political sense, free market oriented. So the Lib Dem Party has been in coalition with the Conservatives. They tend to be more libertarian on many issues, pro-gay marriage,
favor of individual rights, and so on. And generally more free market than the Labour Party. So they're broadly a mildly classical liberal party, let's put it that way. Not as strong as some have been in the past, but that's roughly what they've represented in British politics. One could say a little bit more. They've had some members who are not so liberal in their orientation, but by and large, they've been a free market, soft, classical liberal party in British politics. Is that adequate there? And there are lots of countries where there are liberal parties that have the name liberal in them. Some of them are not very liberal anymore because party leadership and members change and the name was the same, but the ideas were sucked out of it. That happens quite consistently. And even in Russia, you have a liberal democratic party, and it does not seem particularly liberal, and it certainly does not seem very democratic. So that's an example of terms just being plucked out of the air without any meaning behind that. Any other thoughts? I would like to encourage you, if you're interested, there's the inliberty.ru website. You might want to visit it. There's a lot of material and research and books available on these topics. You can download those PDFs or order it. And they do lots of seminars also for academics, journalists, writers. They have really interesting professors and writers for mostly from Assad, all kinds of Russian newspapers and magazines, as well as university students. It's well worth visiting it and seeing if it's of any interest to you. Any other thoughts? You going to show? Okay. Thank you very much for your interest.
Maybe, sorry for the question.
Okay.
Yes.
So, told us about different ways of understanding liberty and how do you define and how do you understand the term of liberalism?
Liberalism.
Yeah. I mean, are you agree that liberalism with different ways of understanding, or do you have any special ways of thinking of the term? Maybe you have in your own conception of liberalism.
Well, I'm what would be called a classical liberal or libertarian of the American sense of the term. I think it's a broad range. You don't have to. It's not the sort of philosophy where you have to answer a questionnaire and get 100% of the answers right. There's a wide range of views, what we call political libertarian. You can have disagreements on political strategies and matters. But fundamentally, a limitation of the power of the state. The state should not dictate to people how they live, what they smoke, whom they marry, all these long list of things. Those are matters of personal and private choice. The state should not dictate to people, as we see now in Russia today, talking about homosexuality in public is illegal. I just find this bizarre and strange and unjust. And then in the economic sphere, it's the same principle. People should be able to manage their own lives based on what is called the presumption of liberty. Actually, that's the most important concept. Leave it one. We should leave it at that. Socialist perspective, nationalist perspective, statist generally is as follows. There's a presumption of power. The state is presumed to have the power to tell you what to do, unless it gives you a special freedom. What will give you this special right or freedom? But the presumption is the state can do anything it wants. The liberal perspective is the opposite of that. It says you should be presumed to be able and free to do anything you want, unless there's a reason to restrain you. So we presume you are free. It has the same fundamental structure as the presumption of innocence in a court of law. So if I come up to you and say, last week on Thursday there was a robbery, I charge you with it, prove you are innocent. You can't. The burden of proof is too heavy. And even if you proved you were innocent of that case, you were in Japan at the time, you couldn't have been there. I could charge you with something else. Prove you're innocent of that. The burden is too big. So the burden is on me, the prosecutor in this case, to prove You did it before you can lose your freedom. And similarly, the liberal perspective is the presumption of liberty. If you want to sing a song, you should be presumed free to sing. You don't have to go to the Ministry of Music and wait in line for a form to sing a song. Or if you want to bake a cake, you shouldn't have to go to the Ministry of Baking and get all these forms and paperwork to be able to bake a cake. Just bake the cake, sing the song. Unless there's a sufficient reason to restrict it. For example, you want to sing the song at 3:30 in the morning with a huge loudspeaker. Well, that keeps everyone awake. It might be a good reason to stop you. Or the baking creates sparks that create a fire that burns down your neighbor's house. Okay, you should not be able to do that. But the burden is on the one who would restrict you, not on you to exercise your freedom. You should not have to justify yourself to the state or anybody else. You shouldn't have to, unlike in Germany, for example, in order to organize a religion, you have to prove to the state that it's a reasonable religion. But that's crazy, in my opinion. It's just insane. When the Scientology religion, if you know what this Scientology movement is, they were illegal in Germany, and I heard the Minister of Justice say, yeah, she said, but the things they're teaching aren't true. What kind of philosophy is that? She's a Roman Catholic, for one thing. I'm not a Catholic, so I think what she believes is untrue. So I should make her illegal? The liberal perspective says, if you want to hang out Scientology tracts for Mormonism or anything, Hinduism, that's up to you. You don't have to go prove you should have the right to do it to the state. If your action is harmful to the rights of others, then you can be restricted. You can't walk into their house. They hand out literature if they don't permit it. But aside from that, you should be free to do what you want. So the philosophy of liberalism is about this presumption of liberty, and where the burden should rest is to restriction of your behavior. The state should be restricted. You should be free, unless there is a sufficient reason to restrict your behavior. A good reason is it's harmful to the equal rights of another person. Now that might seem like an obvious point, but it has great significance in the organization of the state all around the world. In most countries, if you want to do something, you have to go get permission. If you want to organize a meeting in Egypt, you have to go to the ministry and get permission to hold a meeting. You can't just do it. In Russia today, if you want to organize an NGO, it's a nightmare. You have to go these forms and show death certificates of your grandparents and so on, as opposed to just organizing a group of people without having to get any permission to do so. And I don't want to pick on any one country. The United States is full of crazy illiberal restrictions as well. That I think is the key political principle of liberalism, is just the presumption of liberty. There are other elements that come out of this, the understanding that voluntary exchange is mutually beneficial, for example. Here, Carl Schmitt sees it the other way. He thinks if you and I buy and sell butter, if I sell you butter, somehow I'm superior to you, and you're being exploited by me. Liberals see it as if it's a voluntary exchange in a market, which means you have the right to go to another seller of butter. The exchanges will be mutually beneficial. But illiberal philosophies typically see market exchange as inherently exploitative. Liberals do not. That's a substantive disagreement on the nature of exchange. Is that adequate?
Well, yeah, it's kind of classic understanding of liberalism. And, well, another short question about law for yourself. In classical understanding, is given by the state, and what about any other forms of laws?
Yeah, that's an important point. The state may be a source of law, but it cannot be the only source of law. And that is again a difference from most statist perspectives, which is the state is the unique source of law.
Yeah, just you're talking about the state form of viewing law, like looking at dangerous situation and
assuming it's preemptive, but is there any other kinds of law for situations not like that? I mean,
yeah, absolutely. Contract law is not a feature, is not a creation of the state. People make contracts, they're actually making law. Take a simple example. What's happening in internet law? You see all kinds of new rules and principles emerging to govern human behavior. It's not created by any state. International commercial law is not state-created law. It goes back over 1,000 years to the Lex Mercatoria, and it governs commercial trade all over the world. It's not a creation of any state body, and it's usually not even enforced by the state. They're private arbitration courts. Ron Fuller, the classical liberal professor at Harvard University Law School, had a definition of law that I really like. It's very broad. It's sufficient to capture, I think, a wide range of law. He said, law is the enterprise of subjecting human conduct to the governance of rules. So even such things as conversation has certain rules to govern conversation. So let's just take the opposite. I'm standing here, and you put up your hand, and I discuss it. Well, it could be different, right? We could have all kinds of different ways. Maybe I should sit down, and I should raise my hand. Or there might be other ways we would realize that we would have a conversation. But those are the rules in rooms like this. But no state created that. There's not a big law book that says how that has to work. When you go to a cafeteria and you want to sit at a table, sure, you put your books down. Then you go get your food, and you come back, and that's where you sit. If you came back and the books are all on the floor, this would be outrageous. That's a law. And we all understand it, right? We enforce it amongst ourselves. And it makes it more convenient when we interact. So liberalism tends to have a more pluralistic understanding of law. It's not just the expression of power and force. That's why under liberalism, all kinds of institutions have emerged to change human behavior, to be more social, but they don't involve violence. So as an example, credit instruments and debt. It used to be, if I owed you a debt, I couldn't pay it, I became your slave, right? Common in the ancient world. A lot of people became slaves because they couldn't pay back their debts. Really horrible concept. That changes, then you get debtors' prisons. So long as I can't pay you, I have to go to a prison and make things until I can pay off the debt. This is unbearable. The modern world, under liberal institutions, eliminated all of those things, and now here's what happens. If I owe you money and I can't pay it back, I don't go to prison. I don't become your slave. You can't come and take a pound of flesh like Shakespeare describes in The Merchant of Venice. What happened is I get a bad credit rating. And I can't borrow money anymore because people say, this guy doesn't pay his debts, so be careful when you do business with him. That gives me an incentive to generate a good reputation, but there's no violence. Once again, though, many socialists see that as violent, and liberals don't. They see that as a form of social cooperation. But it is a form of social cooperation. It's law-governed, but it's not violent. So increasingly, liberalism is about removing violence from life. And I'll mention one book I really like. Actually, two books. This one I wrote and edited, and it just came out this year. And if you want, you can put in my name and the word by liberty, and you can go to a PDF. I have some essays in it, as well as a lot of others. A bigger book, and this one has lots of charts, and graphs, and all kinds of fun stuff in it. It's about this thesis. Is by Steven Pinker from Harvard University Psychology Department. It's a very interesting book. He argues that the human experience of violence is declining, and it has been for about 8,000 years. with obviously steep declines, and up and down, and so on. Long-term trend has been down. It's really quite an interesting thesis, and even the counterintuitive elements, he deals with it very, very carefully. He's a really serious social scientist, statistician. One of the things he argues is liberalism has been substantially triumphant, and that liberal principles of voluntary interaction and avoiding violence have been internalized into the behavior of increasing shares of the human race. And he points out, by the way, even though levels of violence in Africa, parts of Asia and Latin America are higher than they are, let's say, in Europe, that nonetheless they're lower than they were, that the trend is downward. Russia stands out, by the way. Russia has a rather high level of violence compared to, say, other European countries. But nonetheless, even that, it's a positive trend. So that's what he's looking at, is the trend line is generally positive. It's a great book. I really, really recommend it.
Sorry, I can interrupt you. You're talking about the violence in Europe, in America, North America, yes? And what about the rest of the world?
He says all the rest of the world, everywhere, it's going down. So, in other words, as I said, it's still higher in Africa than it is in Europe, but it's lower in Africa than it was 20, 40, 50, 60, 80, 100 years ago.
What do you understand by violence? Because, like, if you take 100 years ago, Africa and India was colonies of European countries. So, if you understand violence by killing people or, I don't know,
That's basically
torturing, yes, we can say that maybe there's less of violence. But if we understand violence by new form of like economical maybe form, and even if we take not Africa, even in the physical form, I don't think that there's less violence than 100 years ago, because we have all Africa, all the countries is under the war, like water war, minerals war, and all the rest kind of.
Let me put it this way, the likelihood of you being killed by another human being is lower than any other time in history. Let's put it that way.
The lower level.
The likelihood, the possibility, that when you die because another human being killed you, is the lowest it's been in the history of the human race. That's what he's focusing on. The likelihood that you'll be raped, murdered, have your hands cut off. By that's what he means by violence. Metaphorical violence, if you mean being insulted or having your religion disrespected, you could call that violence if you will. But he's talking about the core thing that everybody understands about violence. Having a big piece of metal plunged through your heart so that your blood comes out and dying because of that. The likelihood of you experiencing that is the lowest it's ever been in the history of the human race. That's one of the reasons people live longer.
Well,
But that's a good thing, don't you think?
well, I doubt it, because I'm sure that it's true. Maybe there is some.
Okay, but let me put it this way. You'd have to go to his case. He might be right, he might be wrong.
Yeah.
If he's right, is it something we should be happy about?
No.
No? Okay, why not?
Well, okay. If we take Europe and North American region, that's right.
No, we're just talking about any place. Any things
I
that
guess-
represent any place.
Okay, maybe there's some.
That's what it's about. That's what it's about.
Last one question about the law. We were talking about different ways of internal law, maybe state or other people. Is there any, how do you think, is there any external law?
External law?
External law.
What does that mean?
Law given by something ideal, maybe ethics,
So religion may be a source of law, and many people believe it is.
No, I'm not talking about religion. I'm talking about like, okay, if not God, but like ideal ethics.
Yeah, sure, of course, absolutely.
And,
But different people have a different understanding of what that is. So you might be a Kantian, another person is a utilitarian, another person believes in the Bible as offering guidance to behavior. So obviously there can be all sources of ethical guidance. But in terms of enforcement of the law, the state is not the only force.
yeah, sure.
But there are many people who think it is. Legal positivists think all law comes from the state.
Yeah.
And I think that's just factually incorrect. Yes, ma'am.
Could you say some words about how the collapse of the Soviet Union affected the development of liberalism and liberal doctrine in Europe? Because during the Cold War there was a very sharp actualization of socialist and liberal discourses, and there was the other against which there was liberalism was developing as a kind of a coherent alternative system. What's happening now when there is no, after the victory of liberalism actually?
Well, first of all, I don't think there was so much a victory of liberalism, there was a failure of communism, which is a different matter. Vladimir Vygotsky put this very nicely at a conference he spoke at. He said that people like to think there was a big debate between liberalism and communism, and liberalism won. He said, this never happened. It didn't happen. One side ran out of money and collapsed. So that's really what was going on. The system was so broken and corrupt, it ran out of money and it collapsed. They could not afford their empire anymore. They began to cut the ties with Poland and Czechoslovakia and so on. And it unraveled, it came apart. But not because there was a big debate. Gorbachev was not liberal. He did not think liberal thoughts. Initially, he started out in the Soviet Union wanting to have the law on unearned income. He wanted to tighten it, to make socialism really work. It just made it even more inefficient. So that debate didn't happen. The second point is that in some ways the existence of the socialist bloc, Soviet Union and China, eroded liberalism in the liberal countries. Because people said we have to be more like them to fight them. So there was more statism in the United States and in Western Europe. We have to have state management of this so we can be strong against the foreign enemy. So in some ways that actually undermined, it didn't strengthen the liberal ideas, it cut away the ground from them. And the classical liberals criticized these things, such as military conscription. They said, why should we become totalitarian in order to fight totalitarianism? Conscription and slavery. They said, well, the Soviet Union had it. They said, why should we become more like them? So it was a complex relationship. Now, intellectually though, if you had a spectrum, let's say, between liberal market approach and socialist, communist approach, one end of the spectrum disappeared, setting aside North Korea, but it really evaporated. And a major source of those ideas was eliminated. Many people don't realize the Soviet Union spent a huge amount of money, of Soviet people's money, propagating communist ideology in the world. So go to the airport, you can find every book by Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Stalin was translated into good Arabic, and they're still in the bookstores. That was Soviet influence. When I was in Iraq and Kurdistan, some people didn't speak good Arabic, you know what language they all shifted to? Russian. They're all Soviet trained. And so that imprint was left. That institution collapsed, and that meant one end of the spectrum was gone. So in a sense, almost all political discourse shifted in a more liberal direction. But look at the Labour Party. The Labour Party under Blair was more liberal than the Conservative Party before Mrs. Thatcher. The whole spectrum shifted over more, in general, towards more liberal perspective. There was, however, an additional counter-response. Many of the policies that were called liberalism either were partially unsuccessful or were not very liberal. But liberalism got the blame for both. And I think Russia is an example of this. The problem of the Yeltsin years, which many people identify with liberalism, was a problem of a dissolved state that couldn't do anything effectively. It couldn't run automobile factories, we already knew that, but it even couldn't provide personal security on the streets. The privatization process had a lot of benefits, but it was corrupt and internally full of special actors who got inside deals. People then called that corruption liberalism, and it consequently acquired a bad flavor or smell because of that. But here's one of the problems with regard to this. One, a lot of this wasn't liberalism, it was just cronyism. But the second thing, I heard a speech of a Russian liberal who was a young man during that period and was an economist now with the National Academy, and he really spoke out very strongly. He said to some Europeans who criticized, oh, everything you did was bad and so on. He said, look, you are asking why we didn't have more honest people in the Soviet Union. They killed them, that's why. He said, where were all these honest people going to show up to do this honest privatization? We had the most corrupt state in the planet. He said, that's what we had. And those are the institutions we had. And I think we did not a bad job, given the initial conditions were so terrible. So I said, if you had a whole bunch of English lawyers come in, then it would have been better. But we didn't have a lot of English lawyers at the end of the Soviet Union. We had apparatchiks, and we had party placeholders, and we had a population who was afraid and had been decimated by purges and war and catastrophe. He said, that's what we had. And with all the problems, I think we did pretty well. And I think that's not a bad response, given the initial conditions. But it would take time to rebuild the understanding of liberalism as a rule of law rather than cronyism, of open, transparent legal institutions, of accountable government through competitive elections. All those institutions are going to be difficult to rebuild. The last point, I think that, and here I'm not quite a materialist, but I think economic forces have an impact. The rise in commodity prices, in particular the oil price, it's very difficult to establish a rule of law in a resource extraction state. It's not impossible, but it's difficult. And when you have a flow of resources to the state, independent of the citizens, it's not a good recipe for accountability, because they don't have to be accountable to their citizens. They have, the decision makers of the state have their own revenue stream, whether it's oil money or in previous centuries gold mines or salt mines, and so on. Now it's primarily oil and gas. And that is a long-term institutional problem to come up with institutional mechanisms to cause the state to be responsive to the population and competitive elections. Russia doesn't have that right now, unfortunately. How we're going to get it is going to be interesting puzzle. So that it's a complex question, and I gave you a very, very complex answer. But I would finally say neoliberalism, which is one of the things we're talking about, emerged as the insult to mean everything in the world I don't like. And those are then associated with institutions of the market, property, privatization, and so on. And so any time we saw a privatization process that was not transparent, where there were inside deals, clearly in some cases there were, Russia was pretty standard for that. That's then called liberalism. But those transparent privatizations that have taken place in other countries are never identified as such. Right? So the British privatization process was extremely transparent. The privatization process in Germany was honest, open, above board, proper accounting, transparent to everybody, and I think extremely successful. He didn't get oligarchs out of the German privatization process. In any case, if you want to write to me an email, it's easy, and I'll try and answer it and provide links or anything like that that any literature you might want. So you can drop me a note if you're interested in some of these questions. And if you want, I do have a couple chapters in some of the books that just put in my name, Tom Palmer, Why Liberty is one book, and the little PDF the publisher put online. So you can download it. Thank you very much for your time.